So welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I am Gloria Coelho, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We do this through online interviews and presentations by guest speakers. We also do this through classes and study groups that are all online now since the pandemic. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science, consciousness, spirituality, and philosophy. We now have somewhere between 80 and 90 presentations that we have recorded, and you can see them on our website as well as on our YouTube channel, which is Caritas Consciousness Project. Our website is caritascenter.org. And as a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members, donors, to keep our program going. So if you enjoy our presentations and would like to support our program, you can make a donation or become a member on our website, and we really appreciate that. So let me now introduce our guest speaker. And Riane Eisler is the recipient of many honors, such as the Distinguished Peace Leadership Award, earlier given to the Dalai Lama, and internationally known for her groundbreaking contributions as a systems scientist, futurist, and cultural historian. She's author of many books, including The Chalice and the Blade, now in its 57th U.S. printing and 27 foreign editions. And that is an amazing classic. I think that opened my eyes when I read it, and many others. Eisler's innovative whole system research offers new perspectives and practical tools for constructing a less violent, more egalitarian, gender-balanced, and sustainable future. She's president of the Center for Partnership Systems, which provides practical applications of her work, and editor-in-chief of the online Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, published at the University of Minnesota. She keynotes conferences worldwide, has taught at many universities, has written hundreds of articles and contributions to both scholarly and popular books, pioneered the application of human rights standards to women and children, and consults to businesses and governments on the partnership model introduced by her work. For more information, you can go to her website, rianeeisler.com, and also www.centerforpartnership.org. Okay, so welcome, Riane, and thank you so much for being here and accepting my invitation for tonight.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. And well, I'm going to, not surprisingly, talk with you a little bit about what I call the urgently needed and real revolution in consciousness. And in my newest book, which is called Nurturing Our Humanity, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2019. It's very accessible, by the way. There's a chapter called Contracting or Expanding Consciousness. And we're in a time when millions of people worldwide are contracting their consciousness in a major regression to what I've called the domination systems configuration, whether it's rightist or leftist or as secular or religious or Eastern or Western or Northern or Southern or capitalist or socialist. I'm going to propose to you that these categories that we've all inherited, and we inherited from more rigid domination times, and I'll get to that they actually constrict our consciousness because they fragment our consciousness. First of all, none of these categories really describe the whole social system, do they? Just, they focus on this or that aspect of it. There have been repressive, regressive, violent regimes in every one of these categories. So none of them tell us what we need to build and what we can build to really have a more equitable, caring, and sustainable future. And most remarkably, if you really think about it, if you just for a moment go outside what you've been taught in schools and universities, these categories either marginalize or just ignore the majority of humanity, women and children. Now think about that. That's huge. And part of the waking up of consciousness has happened to me, by the way. And I'll tell you a little about myself in a minute. Was to realize that in all my years of so-called higher education, there had been hardly anything by, about, or for people like me, women. And that was a big aha, by the way. But to continue with that chapter that I'm talking about now, contracting or expanding consciousness, and I'll get back to that. Expanding consciousness is really what a lot of people are doing. But what we have lacked is a frame for that. And my work and the research of others now too introduces a completely different approach to studying social systems, as well as a new system for understanding social systems, past, present, and the possibilities for our future, as well as changing them. And so it is the domination, partnership, social scale. No society is a pure partnership configuration or a pure domination configuration. We have a mix actually here in the United States. If we didn't have a mix, and if we still oriented more closely to the domination side, we'd be killed for having this conversation. Okay? Is that simple? In fact, sometimes when I say it as a joke, but it's not a joke, it's really true, that when I get depressed about what's happening in our world, I think of the European Middle Ages. Why? Because in terms of this new perspective, they really oriented almost to a T to the domination system. Yes, there were some partnership elements, okay? I mean, like in the later Middle Ages, there was Mariology, so-called, the veneration of the Virgin Mary, which brought in some stereotypically feminine values as well with her, caring, caregiving, nonviolence, which in domination systems, which have very rigid gender stereotypes, are off limits for men, right? Because the socialization for men in these systems is not being like a woman, right? And it's not a question of women against men or men against women, because, think of all the women who think of a sensitive guy as a wimp, right? Or a sissy, a weak sister. It's really a question of consciousness, isn't it? And we come by domination-oriented consciousness, which we all have inherited, by the way, to varying degrees, very honestly, because it has been transmitted to us and it continues to be transmitted to us, even though it's being questioned, as I said, questioned in bits and pieces. Now, when I speak of a revolution in consciousness, I'm going to invite you, at least for now, leave behind, conventional thinking. I mean, think about it. Einstein said it very well, didn't he? He said, we cannot solve problems with the same consciousness that created them. So I'm asking you to leave behind these old categories and join me for a moment in what's going to be a very quick description of the two contrasting configurations of the partnership system and the domination system. And it's really a biocultural scale, because as my latest book, Nurturing Our Humanity, shows, among other things, is findings from neuroscience, which is a quote hard science, right? Not just psychology, that we are not born with completely formed brains. Our brains develop in interaction with our environments. So the issue is not genes, as social biologists would have us think, but gene expression. And all of this, I mean, I really urge you to read Nurturing Our Humanity, because it has the evidence from neuroscience about what I'm talking about, as well as from anthropology and archaeology. But anyway, so the issue then is one of culture, because for humans, I mean, everything around us, the chair you're sitting on, the technology that we're using to communicate, and the culture, the institutions, our families, our religion, our education, our politics, our economics, they're really human creations, aren't they? And so we have created them, we can change them. And one of the findings, before I go into the configuration, is that actually we have been told false stories. That's how one way that domination systems maintain and perpetuate themselves. And one of these false stories concerns the notion that it's human nature to be violent, to be purely selfish, etc., etc. In reality, what neuroscience shows is that the so-called pleasure centers of our brains light up more when we share and care than when we win or dominate, okay? But in order for that to happen, we have to also have a system that rewards us and that encourages our behaviors. So maybe before I even go into the configuration, I'll go into the configuration. If you look at the partnership domination social scale, as I said, it transcends our conventional categories. You see certain patterns and interconnections that keep repeating themselves. And one of the things that has happened is that more and more scientists, including physicists, quantum physics, for example, are beginning to realize that you cannot understand living systems, and certainly human societies are complex living systems, right? By just simple causes and effects. Chaos theory, nonlinear dynamics, self-organization theory, quantum physics actually, are showing more and more and more the importance of looking at the interconnection of various parts of the system. All right, so patterns, configurations. If you look at societies that on the surface and in terms of old categories are completely different, contemporary societies like Khomeini's Iran, religious fundamentalist societies, or ISIS, or the Taliban, actually have the same configuration as Nazi Germany. As I mean, if you take into account women and children now, which you have to, if you're really going to understand society, okay, which is a huge blind spot in conventional approaches. All right. Stalin's former Soviet Union, Putin's Russia. What is very interesting, for example, and in the new epilogue written on the 35th anniversary of the Chalice and the Blade, so I urge you to get a new copy of it. It's not expensive. You can get it online. I write about this. Putin in 2018 significantly reduced the penalty, the legal penalty, for family violence. Why would he do this? Well, he understands, as do people trying to push us more back towards the domination side, that there is a connection between an authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive, violent family and an authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive, violent state. That is part of the configuration that you cannot see through the lenses of conventional categories. You just don't see it. So what is the difference between the partnership and domination configuration? First, you have this authoritarian structure in domination systems, in the family, in economics, in politics, in both the family, in intimate relations, in gender relations, and in the state, okay? Secondly, you have rigid gender stereotypes. Now, we're all taught, aren't we, that, oh yeah, gender, well, it's a women's issue, or maybe it's a men's issue now with the men's movement, but it's marginalized, right? Actually, it's a key social issue. And in my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, the subtitle is Creating a Caring Economics. Caring Economics. When I wrote that book in 2007, and it was just translated into German, updated a little bit in some of the references, but it's still completely relevant. That book really highlights what I call the gendered system of values that are part of domination economics, because it isn't only the domination economics of so-called neoliberalism. They're wonderful at names, by the way. I mean, think about it, neoliberalism, right? Sounds good. Well, it doesn't happen to be either neo nor liberal. It's pure trickle-down economics, is pure domination economics. Whether it's a Chinese emperor or empress, because remember, not an issue of women against men or men against women, or whether it's a Hindu sheikh or pasha, or a Muslim sheikh or emir. It doesn't really matter. It is like in feudal times when those on bottom were supposed to content themselves with the scraps dropping from the opulent tables of those on top. So this gap that we are seeing widening is built into a regression to the domination system. I mean, that's really what it is, okay? So gender is very important. Then there is violence and abuse. Now, how do you really maintain rigid rankings of domination, whether it's man over man, man over woman, race over race, religion over religion, etc., sexual orientation over, you have to ultimately back it up with fear of either losing your life, a force, or being hurt. I mean, think of, again, the European Middle Ages, the Inquisition, the Crusades, right? The witch burnings. I mean, human rights? I mean, what are you talking about? As St. Augustine famously said, for anyone to even think of questioning their status in life, it's like a nose wanting to be an eye. Okay? I mean, out of consciousness, right? Out of consciousness. And if you even thought the wrong thing, like Galileo, ooh, you were in trouble. So that's why, as I said, when I get depressed, I think of the European Middle Ages. Because even though there were some partnership elements, remember, it's always a matter of degree, we have come a long way, at least in some areas of the world, like we're living in. All right, so you have institutionalized, built-in structural violence in domination systems. Putin got it. I mean, he really got it. Fear, that's what holds the system together. I wrote a book. Well, you can go to my website or to the website of the Center for Partnership Systems, and you'll find that I've written quite a few books because I'm pretty old by now. And they follow a certain pattern, culminating really in nurturing our humanity. I wrote a book on education. I don't know if any of you are teachers, Tomorrow's Children, and my books sort of prefigure each other. But anyway, and the fourth difference, and there is some violence in partnership systems. I mean, look, people lose it sometimes, but it doesn't have to be built in. That is a huge, huge difference. And of course, the fourth is story and language. Why is language so important? Well, think of the categories, right, that we've been taught. They're a good example. And linguistic psychologists have told us for a long time that the categories provided by a culture's language really are tremendously important because they make it very difficult, if not impossible, to see other alternatives, don't they? So I am suggesting to you a holistic whole systems approach. And if you read my books, The Chalice and the Blade was the first book to introduce that. And of course, it shows something that we really need to understand, which is that this configuration was actually, the partnership configuration was actually contrary to what we're told, whether it's original sin or selfish genes. It's the same story, they fight each other. But what is it? It's the same story, isn't it? We're bad. We have to be rigidly controlled from the top, right? God-fearing. I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? So what I want to share with you is so much, but I won't be able to. And even in our question and answer, we'll only be able to, I'm sure that many of you can already relate to this, because one of the comments from people who have read my books is that, first of all, that they're full of aha moments, as the research was for me. Answer things that seemed completely random and disconnected suddenly made sense. And this takes me to prehistory, because when I was a little girl, I wanted to know, for example, in the Bible, it says that henceforth, woman would be subservient to man. And I always wanted to know, well, fine, but what was it like before the henceforth? Yes? Nobody wanted to talk about it. Well, my research actually found that out. And I also wanted to know, why would a woman want to ask advice from a snake? You know, we don't usually go around asking snakes for advice. I mean, why would Eve do this? And remember, Eve is, I'm going to digress for a moment, but there are two stories in the Bible. One is a partnership story, a story of origin, in which both woman and man are created by Elohim in its image, in the divine image. The other, however, is a story that is absolutely a story of the shift from partnership to domination. And that's the story of how Eve, woman who gives birth yet, was just an afterthought, and was an afterthought that was created out of a man's rib on top of that. Moreover, like Pandora's box or other such domination stories, she is to blame for all of men's ills. You know, Jungian archetypes, woman is either man's inspiration, his muse, or she's his threat, his perdition. Pure domination archetypes, aren't they? It's fascinating. And Jung, I had a lot, I mean, he understood about story, but he didn't have the frame. You know, he just was completely in the domination frame, I'm afraid. So the story of the snakes, why did she ask advice from a snake? You know, nobody wanted to talk about that. Well, if you really think about it, you remember the Oracle of Delphi, even in already Greek times. Leaders would go to Delphi and have a pythoness working with a snake, putting herself in an oracular trance, answer their questions. And if you know Minoan art, which is one of the last civilizations described in some detail, in orienting more to the partnership side, and you can read a lot about it in The Chalice and the Blade, in my book Sacred Pleasure, which looks at sexuality and spirituality primarily, and the remissing, because I have two chapters already in The Chalice and the Blade called Reality Stood on Its Head. And that's the reality, quote unquote, why do we call it myths as something that isn't true? Because so many myths are not true. But some of the most fundamental myths, like that this is human nature, is false. And I will close in just a moment because I really want to talk with you. But I will give you one example, aside from Minoan Crete, of course. The largest Neolithic site ever excavated is in Anatolia in Turkey, and it's called Çatalhöyük. And lo and behold, there are no signs of destruction in this site for 1,000 years, no signs of destruction through war. So the notion that we're inherently warlike, you know, and a lot of academics really start with that assumption. Still, the archaeological evidence, however, shows that warfare is at most 5,000 to 10,000 years old. That's a big difference, you know, considering that we've been around for our species for 100 million years. And that was just in the last megasecond of evolution that we came on the scene. But anyway, Çatalhöyük was much more egalitarian. We know this from the size of houses, from the nature of the grave goods, because they had a very cyclical belief in birth. Well, first it started with sex, because sex was part of the cycle of regeneration. You know, they observed it in animals, they observed it in people. This notion that men took over because they found that they have a role in procreation is absolutely a lie, because in some of the friezes, for example, the frieze from Çatalhöyük, which is about 6,000 BCE, because about 8,000 years ago it started, shows a woman and a man, and right next to them, the woman with a baby. Well, I mean, yes, it's an ancient depiction of what scholars call the sacred marriage, the hieros gamos, but it's also a lesson in sex education, isn't it? I mean, the man and woman in embrace, and then the woman and the man in a child. And it was gender balanced. As one of the archaeologists who excavated Çatalhöyük for a long time, Ian Hodder, and this is in my books, noted in an article in the Scientific American, with some astonishment, I must say, there are no signs that having been born male or female made any difference in one's status or one's roles. So more of an orientation to the partnership side of the continuum. That's not to say that we want to go back to any good old days, but we know what the configuration is. And so to really fast forward, I've proposed 4 cornerstones that we really have to pay attention to, because those pushing us back with their focus on social issues, focus on those. One is childhood. And the subtitle of Nurturing Our Humanity is how domination and partnership shape our brains, lives, and future. And it really is based on neuroscience, but not just on how families do this. Families don't just, economics, families, none of our institutions spring up out of no place. They're part of a larger culture, aren't they? And they're very different depending on the degree of orientation to either end of the partnership domination scale, okay? So why, then you can see why childhood is so important. I mean, consider if a child is brought up with, quote, traditional punishment, right? What does that child learn? That it's okay to use violence to impose your will on others. Very, very clear lesson, very key to a domination system. The second cornerstone is gender, and they're all interconnected. What does a child learn with a model of our species where the male form, and is, because there are really only 2 basic forms in our species, female and male, right? Where the male form is considered superior to the female form, where difference is equated with superiority or inferiority, with dominating or being dominated, with being served or serving. It's a template, isn't it, for all forms of in-group versus out-group scapegoating, thinking, enemy mentality, and for the denial. I'm going to again be somewhat nonlinear here before I go on to economics and to story and language. But studies show, and they are in my work, that people who are brought up in domination subcultures or cultures, starting in families, that they learn denial. It starts with the denial that the people on whom they are dependent for life, for food, for shelter, for clothing, for everything, are causing them pain, right? Be it psychological pain or physical pain. And so I really won't go into the details, but if you read Nurturing Our Humanity, you'll see why we see in these subcultures, these, yes, largely subcultures based on fear of God, God-fearing, fear of parents, fear of punishment of some kind, fear of the other, why you see climate change denial, why you see election result denial, why you see COVID-19 denial. It's part of a larger constriction of consciousness. And studies in Nurturing Our Humanity, I cite one of them, show that the part of our brain, the part that helps us adjust to change, and change is a constant in human life, is actually less effective in people from these backgrounds. Okay? So we have the lens now. We can look at economics from a completely different perspective, because both capitalism and socialism actually challenged domination economics, but they kept intact the gendered system of value. Well, they kept intact the whole devaluation of caring. There is nothing in either capitalist or socialist theory about caring for our natural life support system. Nature was there to be exploited for both Smith and for Marx. But not only that, caring for people starting at birth, and yes, keeping a clean and healthy home environment, which of course also is related to keeping a clean and healthy planetary environment. That was supposed to be done for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. You know, we need to know our history. As late as when Marx was writing, in Europe, in the United States, in the 1900s, a wife could not sue in most jurisdictions for injuries negligently inflicted on her. Only her husband could for loss of her services. I mean, think about that for a moment. That's where they came from. That's where they called the work of caring reproductive, and they excluded from their economic map the three life-sustaining economic sectors: the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy. So you can see that there are trends towards partnership today, aren't there? But they're all over the map. What we need is a partnership movement. And this, of course, leads us to story and to language. I've been telling you a story based on evidence, but it is a story that is still not part of either the mainstream academic conversation, which is totally siloed, by the way, so how could it be? You know, instead of being interdisciplinary like students really want today, it's still, you know, well, it's a mess. And yes, women's and men's studies, gender studies are still marginalized in the academy, even though they finally appeared when, out of about 600 years of so-called modern science, 60 years ago. I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? Well, there's so much that's a little crazy. So we have to change our stories. And I invite you to do two things. One is to really go on our website. There are two sites that I especially would like you to go to. One, we have a partnership technology toolkit that we developed with a grant from the Ford Foundation that I would really like to see if you have friends, colleagues, children, parents, whoever, into technology, creating technology, please tell them about it. And then the other one is a course. And really, this technology toolkit is based on the 4 cornerstones, by the way, because if technology is guided by an ethos of domination, we've had it. and it isn't just technologies of destruction that I'm talking about. It's the brainwashing that can happen with technology, with virtual reality, with AI. I mean, it's serious stuff here. And then the other one is a course that I developed. It's an online, on-demand course that you can take either as an individual or as a group. And in either case, you get to use the resources, including 4 videos, to yourself be a partnership educator. And you don't really need to have a school to do that. You just do it with your friends, your colleagues, It's up to us. And I'll end with something that Margaret Mead said, which is that everything that benefits us, really, that we now take for granted, was due to the efforts of a small group of women and men who were usually quite unpopular and marginalized until what they advocated, like not having child labor, having, lots and lots and lots. And this is a time, aside from voting and getting everybody to vote, and perfection is the enemy here. Tell people to just get out and vote to avert even further regression. Because if you really look at the people pushing us back, they're in denial. They come from subcultures that orient much more to the domination side, and they want to naturally impose all of this on us, the out group, right? Anybody other than them. So we have work to do. We can do it. And as Margaret Mead put it, and quite rightly so, this is not a popularity contest. This is a contest, and it is a contest for our future and for the future of our children and grandchildren and generations still to come. So I thank you.
Riane, would you like me to show those websites?
Would you please? Yes.
Okay.
And share them with your friends. I mean, I know that for some people who are not acquainted yet with my work, some of this is, but it makes so much sense, you see, once you get to it. So one is the Partnership Technology Toolkit, and there are lots of other resources. We have a Caring and Connected Parenting Guide. If you go to the media kits, we have all kinds of graphics that explain the configurations.
Media kits.
And, but here are some of the toolkits, you see.
Yeah, this really explains.
Yeah, I mean, but your voice and your own experience and your own thoughts, these are what will convince people, those who can be convinced, because some people really are hermetically sealed. They're so damaged by the domination system. We're hearing much more about trauma now, which is, again, a partnership trend, right? But as far as I'm concerned, domination systems are trauma factories. And I just got an email from a former, well, he's soon to be a former member of the U.S. Armed Forces, who wants to write a thesis in his PhD thesis on the thesis that all these really, several millennia now of domination-oriented culture are an intergenerational trauma that we have carried with us. Think of all the fear. I mean, if you can't trust women, the person that everybody has a mother if they're here. I mean, whom could you even trust?
Right.
You know, I mean, it's a crazy system. And do show the course, would you? Thank
Okay.
you, Gloria. I'd like you to do that too.
Let me get that one up. Let's see. Oops. 1 second. Okay. Is this it?
Yes, changing our story, changing our lives. And as I said, if you scroll down, there are we used to give it at a certain time, and then we decided that that was not to work, and we're now working on another course on caring economics. But as you can see, there are lots of resources.
Yeah, really a lot. I'm going to have to study this website.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear from some of you now.
Okay.
I've been talking for quite a while, more than I thought, but what the heck? I just kept going, looking at your lovely faces, or as some of you have not got your. I like to see who I'm talking to. It helps, and you know, so many of you were just nodding and yes. So
Yeah. We have a question from Robin,
yes.
which is what are
Partnership archetypes. Oh,
yes.
listen, there's a book that I recommend highly that I wrote with my wonderful late husband, David Loy, as a social psychologist, and it's called The Partnership Way. And it has an exercise for young people, but it can be used by anybody on partnership or domination, heroes and heroines. But what would be a partnership archetype? It would be a woman who taps all of her caring potential, but also because we're socialized, you know, for caring as women, as if men couldn't do it. Well, a partnership archetype for a man would be a caring man, right?
Mm-hmm.
But an assertive woman, a woman who's not afraid and who isn't put down. And if she is put down, who can assert herself? Because think about it, it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, both men and women are deprived of part of their humanity by these rigid gender stereotypes, aren't they? So these are examples, but you know, we're evolving, and the certainly the heroine that's beginning to appear, who uses, you know, she's again this action entertainment person who uses violence. That is not a partnership archetype, even if she's female. I don't care. Just as Margaret Thatcher is not a partnership leader. She wasn't and she isn't. You know, I mean, we're talking about both women and men accessing their full humanity. Because look, we humans have such an enormous capacity, I mean, biologically, for caring, for consciousness, for creativity. But we also have a capacity for insensitivity, for cruelty, and for destructiveness. But which of these is expressed? That is the issue. And that is what we know now from neuroscience really depends to a huge extent on our cultures. And if you're told that culture has no impact, just tell them to read Nurturing Our Humanity and look at the evidence.
Yeah.
And Dawn, you have appeared. Hello. Well,
Um,
I'd love to hear from others.
um, in your book, this book, not your most recent book, but The Real Wealth of Nations that I've been reading.
Hi, Susan. I see Susan has just appeared. All right. Nice to see you. Go ahead, Lori. I'm sorry.
That's okay. You cite examples of companies who have implemented many caring amenities.
Wait, I didn't hear. Somehow you're breaking up.
Am I? Oh
Just
dear.
get a little closer to the mic. That's
Okay. Let me turn up my volume. Maybe that'll help. I don't know. In your book, The Real Wealth of Nations, you cite examples of companies who have implemented many caring amenities and how their caring culture has increased profits and decreased absenteeism and turnover.
That's
Can
true.
can you update us on this in terms of what they're calling the Great Resignation and how it's affected those companies, and how are they adapting to this trend of employees preferring to work from home? Because you cited, I don't remember which company it was, but it sounded like heaven to work there. You know, they had so many.
They had a lot with, and here I want to talk about changing the rules of the game, because most of the companies that I cited were private companies, privately owned. And the idea of a corporate executive making many hundreds of times what an employee makes is frankly obscene.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just something really wrong with the system, but the system encourages it with the quarterly return. There has to be, yes, a quarterly return reporting certain things, but there also has to be longer term thinking. And our rules of the game don't permit that. And I haven't answered your question, but I really did want to make that point. There are some trends, for example, so-called conscious capitalism that you've heard, maybe not about, and indeed we do need markets, but we don't happen to have a free market with all of these mega corporations, you know, the new fiefdoms, right? And we do need government policies. The question is, what kind of government policies? Are they enlightened? And the regression really started with Reagan and his attack on government. And I see Riane is really shaking her head. Yes. No, it was a disaster because government is the one thing that is elected presumably by the people. But elections, as we see writ large with what's happened, are not the answer. The change in consciousness. And yes, changes in family, childhood, gender. That doesn't mean that you stop working at all these other things. Now, get back to the Great Resignation. That is only possible in a way as long as our economy stays up, you know, keeps itself up. And the issue that we face, because so many of our old institutions are failing, is how to transition, really, not as so many nations like, Hungary, for example, is doing, back to more in-group versus out-group and authoritarianism, etc., which is only a stopgap, really, because we live in a totally interconnected world. And it's ridiculous to pretend somehow that Hungary is I mean, the whole thing is denial, denial of reality. So I think the Great Resignation has had the effect of bringing attention to the lack of caring, frankly.
Yes. I
And
think
I
a
think
lot of
that's
people,
really important.
yeah, I think a lot of people during the pandemic, when everything stopped, started really thinking about what they wanted to go back to and what they didn't want to go back to, you know? And so companies, even big corporations started offering more and more amenities, but I'm told that even the amenities don't do the trick if somebody would prefer to work from home. And I think, I don't know, it seems to me a good trend that is forcing us as a culture, as a society, to rethink what work should be. And
And what kind of work should be rewarded?
exactly.
I mean, that is the basic issue. And if we do not reward caring for people in either low wages, ridiculous. I mean, most childcare workers today are on welfare to keep their families fed, frankly. But you know that according to the US Department of Labor, childcare workers earn less than dog walkers. I mean, I love dogs, but this is crazy. But it's also this distinction that is still taught in our economic schools of productive work and reproductive work. And that's the gendered system of values, really manifesting itself in GDP, in our schools, and we have to change it. And that is one thing that COVID helped, I think, a lot of people to see. Of course, other people who are in denial, dismiss all of this. And this is why we have to pay attention to family, to early childhood education, to parenting education, to gender stereotypes, because those are fundamental.
Yeah, I was really shocked, and I don't know why I didn't know this. I guess I just don't really think that much about economics. But I was really shocked when I read in your book that things like cleaning up after an oil spill and the expense of that goes toward the GDP instead of a minus, it's a plus. And,
absolutely.
And the lawyers that were hired to protect Exxon also, because it's all spending, right? And
That's
he's spending goes towards the GDP, so that it looks like a country with a higher GDP is a better country. But if every disaster augments the GDP, that is a really skewed way of looking at economics and the health of a country.
Well, it's a crazy way, because consider with climate change how more severe is the droughts, the hurricanes, etc., and all the rebuilding is going to go into GDP. I mean, it is a crazy way of reality stood on its head.
And military expense. So the more wars we have, the higher the GDP.
Of course. But, I'm a Holocaust survivor, so I really want to say we do need, if you look at the world, our budget is crazy, okay? It's way, way, way over the top. But we do need some military, because there are people out there who are rigidly in the domination mindset. And Mr. Putin is a good example of that, as we see, and they lie. I mean, it's really absolutely nuts, the whole thing, but again, there's a silver lining to this, because we must shift from consuming all this fossil fuel to renewables. So, but the suffering of the most vulnerable people is not ameliorated by our policies. And notice something interesting, that while Biden now talks about caring economics, he just applies it to direct care, okay? But, and he talks about human infrastructure, both terms that I introduced, by the way, in my work. But the thing is, in his latest bill, what was put out was family support. I mean, think about that, if we don't, as women, as parents, as caring men, really work on these fundamental changes in mindset, in consciousness, we'll just see more and more regressions. And it's very dangerous at this point.
Yeah. Riane, I've come across a number of people who, in reaction to dominator style hierarchies, think that all hierarchies are bad. Okay, so would you explain the important distinction between domination hierarchies and what you call actualization hierarchies, which are also known as growth hierarchies in other circles, in some circles?
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because yes, partnership systems rely more on linking than on ranking. However, this said, look, every society needs parents, needs teachers, needs managers, if it's more sophisticated and complex, needs leaders. But the question is, how is this hierarchy constructed? And again, it is really not, I don't want us to think of the unrealistic thing of throwing, so to speak, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, the question is, first of all, in a hierarchy of domination, accountability, respect, benefit really flows from the bottom up. In a hierarchy of actualization, it flows both ways, doesn't it? And power, I mean, one of the graphics that we have up is the distinction between how power is conceptualized. And the title really of the chalice and the blade, I mean, they're two symbols of power, aren't they? The power, the blade is very appropriate for domination systems. It's the power to dominate, to control, to take life. The chalice is also very powerful. The problem isn't just, that power is bad. It's how do you define power? And if it is the power to give life, to nurture life, to illuminate life, that is a very different power. So I make a distinction. And really, it's becoming more and more common to talk about the distinction between power to, which is creative power, and power with, which is, the power that we have to
power over,
versus power over. And that's a very, very fundamental distinction. And I'm so glad you brought it up. Thank you.
Yes. Robin,
yes, I see the question. How do we assist in the evolution of consciousness in the conflicted and violent state of this country currently? Well, my wonderful husband, David Loy, who was one of the most creative people in the world. And by the way, one of his books is Darwin's Lost Theory. And it really reclaims Darwin, who in his book on human evolution, he called it The Descent of Man. Okay, but he came out of that time, the 1700s. But he said that at the human level, other factors come into play. and they are what he called the moral sense, what he called mutual aid. In other words, he understood that we have choices. And so I really suggest that you, if you feel like it, that you get that book. It's online, Darwin's Lost Theory. But David also made a distinction in one of his, he's a social psychologist, between norm maintainers and norm changers. But it's a much better distinction than right, left, religious, secular, etc., because that is what it's about. But he always pointed out that in the middle is a vast number of people who will go either way. And if we really want to strengthen, because it's about norms, isn't it? What is considered normal in our schools, in our universities, in our mass media of communication, etc. And it's very challenging, but it can be changed. Norms do change. So think about the people in the middle, and those are the people to focus on. I know quite a few people who have read my work who came out of evangelical backgrounds, you know, and we're the good news is that we're really, if anything, predisposed towards more caring, towards more sharing. I mean, but if you don't believe that, then why bother, right? And these people are taught we're sinful. Oh, you know, it. And I see Robin, you have your hand up, please.
Make sure you're unmuted.
I'm good.
Okay.
Yes. So I've noticed something. Maybe you can speak to it. I don't know. But there's a lack of a twinkle in women's eyes, especially around the age 60. And I'm thinking there's a developmental or gender-based disillusionment or a longing for a new life, or that kind of a feeling. I'm mired in a way right now, and I'm working on developing a program to kind of help people navigate that. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that idea.
Well, you know, if you look at some of very ancient myths, like the Tao Te Ching, it talks about the wisdom of a better, more peaceful, more prosperous time when the wisdom of the mother was still venerated. And I think what you're describing is coming head on into a youth-centered, you know, sex object, as women as sex objects, objectifying. Read Sacred Pleasure. It's a book that I wrote on sexuality and spirituality. But I have to tell you, not every woman over 60, I mean, I'm over 60, and I still have a twinkle in my eyes.
Yes, see that.
So I think that we actually have a tremendous opportunity as elders, if you will. And really, today's 60 is more like yesterday's 40s. And I really want to encourage women to not accept the norm of, you know, you're past your prime and you're this and you're that. I mean, nonsense. It's absolutely nuts about that. I mean, and you don't have to, I mean, unless you want to, but really, you don't have to pretend that you're younger. You just are a powerful human being. And so become involved. And if you do give courses, use some of our resources. Use the course on changing our story. And use those videos. I mean, there will be yours to use, because it really starts with the consciousness that we can change norms, and that it is precisely during times of great disequilibrium, great technological dislocation, such as ours, where really it can go either way, okay? So we have an opportunity now to really make a difference. And I think that, hey, you know, the old saying, don't agonize, organize, teach, change consciousness, change behavior, because behavior follows consciousness. Action follows consciousness. And the more we act, the more we change the norms, the more our consciousness can change. So I have great faith in you, Robin.
Thank you.
I think it starts with conversations like this also, you know, the change in consciousness.
Yes.
When we start to think and share what we see, what we observe, and with people like you who have made it their business for many, many years to delve into this with research and understanding.
Well, I've always been an outsider. You know, I was born in Vienna. My parents, and I'm a child refugee with my parents from the Holocaust. I grew up in Cuba and other completely different cultures. So I learned very early on that what people consider just the way things are is not the same everywhere. And that was very important. And frankly, if I hadn't been an outsider, I couldn't have done this work. Because you have to question, as I did. I was always a very curious child, much to the annoyance of the adults around me. like the two examples I gave of wanting to know about the henceforth and about the asking advice from a snake. But you know, I think that the more we explore. Oh, Andrea, you've joined us. Hello. I'm glad you did. The more you explore, the more you question. I really believe in human creativity. And look at this group of women here, of so many different ages. You can make a difference. You have a sphere of influence, and you can expand that sphere of influence. And it's not a popularity contest. It's really about helping people to answer questions that so many of us have had. Does it have to be this way? Just start there. Because the answer is it doesn't. Yes, Celia.
Yeah.
So yes, in line with what you're saying.
I can barely hear you. Can you put up your mic a little?
Okay. Let's see here.
Up on top, there should be a microphone.
Yeah. Is that better?
Well, just shout.
All right, I'll put it up there. Okay. Yeah, so you know, in terms of expanding consciousness, which I really like your, you know, really using that terminology of expansion and contraction. And I mean, I myself have been a feminist my whole life and read your book when I was quite young, Chalice and the Plane, and been in women's groups my whole life. You know, always had some kind of a women's group going, a consciousness raising group, or a spiritual group, or an empowerment group. And I mean, I noticed that now, I mean, women are doing this. We're doing this. We're gathering, we're talking, we're sharing ideas, we're empowering one another. But it feels like there's an expanding consciousness with women now in our world and in our country, when to me, it feels like there's more and more of a gap between women's consciousness and men's consciousness. And and I know so many men who are kind of lost and not finding that same power of community that we engage in.
You know, and community is very important, but a different paradigm. I mean, I get letters all the time from men who have really related to this. I mean, and the comment is always, among other things, I mean, you know, like, give it to my daughter or to my wife or to my sister or whatever, but it's always, there's a place for me in this paradigm. And unfortunately, semantically, feminist is exclusionary. It just is. Not to speak of the fact that, and that's a good way to start, by the way, a conversation, that the only two categories focused on gender that were given by our language are either patriarchy or matriarchy. And they're two sides of a domination coin. The real alternative is partnership. And, you know, I mean, we're talking, many men are quite lost because there are no norms for them as yet, but they're developing. I mean, the explorer is a partnership archetype. So let's explore ideas. The entrepreneur who is conscious of a responsibility, yes, to the business, whatever it may be, but also to the community, to the planet, and who wants to, I mean, but you need the frame. And that is what's still lacking yet in the general conversation. And I count on all of you, really, to change that. And that is what we are now. I'm talking to the Montessori Foundation has purchased the Sarasota University online courses, and we're talking about offering a certificate in partnership studies and another certificate in partnership education. But I think you have to really immerse yourself. I mean, I have immersed myself in this, obviously, but we need thousands of you to really immerse yourselves. And that's why, just as a start, read the books, take the course, and share. Share. And share with men, because men really want to also change, but they don't. I mean, who wants to be considered inferior, for goodness sakes? So we have to show them that this is just a norm that comes with domination systems. And I'm showing them the connection between the gender system of values and everything that we so abhor in our economic policies, be they business policies or be they government policies. Just help them connect the dots.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrea. I'm glad that you're enjoying Chalice. And well, you can all read what Andrea writes. You said something like, men and women both need to experience the full breadth of our humanity. Do you think there are differences between men and women that are relevant? Well, first of all, I'm going to talk about that for a moment. Cordelia Fine is a neuro psychologist, I believe, and she has really written about this. So I recommend her work. The thing is that there are obviously physical differences between us. I mean, we have the capacity to give birth, we have the capacity to give milk, you know, but I think that as far as our capacity for caring and our capacity for consciousness and our capacity for not being sucked into identifying real masculinity, with domination and violence, and real femininity only with, being controlled and subservient and passive. That, I think, is cultural. So my answer to that would be, I think there probably are predispositions, but remember that, for example, we know that in societies, tribal societies, where men do a lot of fathering, and it's very much like mothering, their testosterone levels are lower. I mean, it's not simple. And we also know that even men who are born with a gene that predisposes men, and this is in my books, to violence, are only men who have been traumatized in their childhood really express this as a rule. So you really have to look at the whole picture, And if you don't take into account childhood, and if you don't take into account how flexible we humans are because of our capacity for learning and how much depends on learning, then you're stuck. So my answer would be, yeah, there probably are some differences, especially in predispositions, but we certainly don't know yet, do we? Until we have much more of a level playing field. And until we change the norms and the reward system so that, quote, women's work of caring, caregiving, nonviolence, if you will, are more rewarded. And it has to be a universal change. So then you go, related to that, you think great mother worshipping societies were less violent and, all right, related to, why do you think great mother worshipping societies were less violent than father God worshipping societies? It has to do with the gender stereotypes. Because if you, for example, look at the figure on the cover of the Chalice and the Blade, it's a phallic bird goddess. Mm-hmm. So it's really, they seem to have thought much more in terms of an integrated worldview, which is now coming back with quantum physics, strangely. Some guy just won the Nobel Prize. But anyway, I won't go into that. So yes, I think it has to do with the fact that with the domination system came the ranking of male over female. And it is the ranking and the rigid gender stereotypes. And remember, women were property for so much of domination history. So I think that it's connected to gender of the deities, certainly, but not in the obvious sense. I think gender isn't about women against men or men against women. It's about redefining what being human means for both women and men. So thank you. And I hope I answered your question.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Hi. Let's see. So I have been looking for a graduate program for so long that is looking at culture through a system science lens. I've mostly studied embodiment and somatics and like neurological integration. And it seems to me like part of our learning right now as a species is how we reintegrate into the ecosystem. Like that's part of our participation that we have forgotten or adapted out of in modern civilization. So I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations or aware of like master's programs that are looking at human culture, sociology, or psychology through a complex system science lens, at least in part.
Well, first of all, Dawn, as I mentioned in passing, I am talking to Sarasota University about creating this certificate in partnership studies, which could be part of a master's program. So if you get in touch with me, it won't start until February, and at the earliest. But I think that that's very important, that we have the opportunity, that people have the opportunity really to get a degree in partnership studies, because it will affect all these areas that you're talking about. I mean, for example, the somatic, we see some trends in this direction. I mean, the body remembers, for goodness sakes,
All trauma theory and attachment patterning and the social nervous system is bringing, body mind intelligence. It's giving a neurological explanation or framework for it.
That's right. But it's still on the fringes. And I'm a little worried about the clinical psychology now going in the direction of psychedelics, because they can traumatize people, and psychedelics are not a good mix. And there's so much trauma, in that people, I mean, as I mentioned, there's a guy who actually wants to do his PhD thesis on intergenerational trauma caused by the domination system. So because it starts in childhood, and it's just the economic system is traumatizing. I suggested, Dawn, two things. One, that you read Nurturing Our Humanity, because I think it has a lot of information in there. But you might also want to read a book that I wrote that is kind of a self-help book. It's called The Power of Partnership, and it deals with 7 relationships and how they differ depending on the degree of orientation to the partnership or domination side, starting with how we relate to ourselves, with our intimate and family relations, our business, community, work relations. But then it continues to our national relations, international relations. They're all of one piece, really, in this world now. Our spiritual relations, our environmental relations. But I want to say one thing about what you said about modern times. It's the technology that is more powerful. Domination systems have always had conquest of nature as part of their ethos of domination. So if you look at for example, the felling of forests that the Romans did, horrendous. If you look at some of the herding cultures that at least we know from DNA studies that at least in the Balkan area, they brought the domination model with them. They were herders, and they completely decimated their environments with their, because grazing does that. It doesn't give anything back. So I think that we really have to look at the long view and understand that between overpopulation in a finitely resourced planet, which is a women's issue, by the way. I mean, women don't want to have zillions of children and just be male-controlled technologies of reproduction, right? And between the tremendous technological impact that we've had through the late industrial era, But we can change that. But we can only change it by shifting from a domination to a partnership system.
Well, I just want to say how inspiring you are, and to thank you for this evening's talk with us. Truly, really look forward to reading your books. Yeah, thank you.
Well, and I look forward to how every one of you will use them. And as I said, those of you who are interested in the, first of all, the course that's being offered by CPS, and also in the new certificate program, which may or may not develop into a master's and PhD. I mean, who knows? You know, we're just kind of starting now. Let us know, and we'll keep you in mind. And just be yourselves and enjoy.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Riane, for making the time to be with us this evening. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And we will be posting the video on our YouTube channel so you can share it with others when it gets there.
Okay, well,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.